let's talk about tight ends. How do you think Gronk and Jimmy Graham should be valued this year? And are there any other tight ends that are on their level that would be a good buy, I guess, for you if you can't spend like $30, $40 or like a top number 1 round pick on those guys?
It's interesting. I don't think last year we just saw 2 guys, Jimmy Graham, Robert Gronkowski, who just put up numbers we've never seen before. So it's just so hard to kind of project and predict what they're going to do. I think if you're in a strength draft, I don't think it would be completely crazy if you had like a late first rounder just to take Gronk. Jimmy Graham is probably close behind, probably second rounder. That being said, I think I've seen some projections in the auction format where he's been Robert Gronkowski's been going for like $40. I think it's a little bit overboard. If you're thinking about him as a tight end, yeah, he's gonna be the number 1 tight end, but you're also paying for production that's probably the equivalent of like maybe a decent, a good wide receiver too. So you're gonna have a positional advantage if you have one of these guys, but just don't go completely overboard. Like I said, it's gonna be pretty hard to project who they are, and I would love having them on my team, but certainly just be buyer beware. Don't get into you might find yourself in massive bidding wars. You might just want to step back and think to yourself, is this really what I want to put my money in?
Right.
If you don't get these 2 guys, I would wait. You can get a guy like a Jason Witten or Vernon Davis. That's fine. You're going to get standard tight end production. But if you want to get some upside, you can wait around for later rounds. I like a guy like Jared Cook out of Tennessee. Guy who has a lot of athletic talent and, especially with maybe a bit, not a lot of wide receiver help there. The quarterback who's going to be looking for a safety blanket. Look for a guy like that. Maybe you'll pick him for $1. Maybe he'll be this year's Gronk. So, if you're not going to get Gronk or Jimmy Graham, wait. Just wait and just go for a kind of a high upside, low risk kind of guy.
Yeah, spend your money elsewhere. Maybe you'll get a higher wide receiver. I don't know, a good second running back.
I just wouldn't put $40 into any tight end, even if it's Rob Gronkowski.
Well, first off, I'd just like to say that I completely understand why people are valuing them the way they are. In the snake draft format, some people are taking them as early as the second round. I'm not saying that that's completely, that I would do that. I'm just saying that I completely understand the logic. It's that, if you assume that they're going to have the same production this year, then they were, that's where they were.
You're gonna be disappointed.
Well, I mean, that's where they were, in the rankings. And the other, argument is that they're such, far and away above the other tight ends that in a value-based drafting scenario, they would be a lot more worth it at that position because you can, kind of like get somebody who's like a, starting running back worth points, but you get them at the tight end position where people aren't getting points.
Right.
Now, for that said, I think that Gronk and Jimmy Graham are vastly overvalued, especially Gronkowski, because I think that he's going to have, there's so many players on that team now. I can't imagine him, putting the same amount of touchdowns. Like that 17 touchdowns is just ridiculous. But I do think they're both still going to have good years. I think that you're going to want to try to get one of them if you get a good deal on them. But I wouldn't I wouldn't take him in the second round. I wouldn't take him for $40, $45 like some people are trying to take Gronk. That much I wouldn't do. In terms of other tight ends you might want to look out for, there's always a lot of them. There's a lot of younger upside guys. But the one I'd really take a look at this year is Antonio Gates. Now, if you look at like the auction values right now on ESPN, Jimmy Graham and Gronk are just like far and away like sky high value, and Antonio Gates is only worth like $12 estimated. That's not that much for a guy who's literally his only offensive piece left in San Diego. Phil Rivers loves Antonio Gates, and yes, he's had injury issues the last few years, no doubt about it. But if he puts, it's been a while since he's put it back together, and I think this year is going to be the year. He's had a long time to recover, and I think that it's not going to be Malcolm Floyd or Robert Meacham over there. I think it's going to be all Antonio Gates. I think you're going to see another 1,000-yard, like 8 touchdown season from him. He's going to be a fantasy stud, and for $12, he's going to be completely worth it. Other guys to look at, Jason Witten's going to be a big factor in Dallas, and some of the younger guys, like Adam said, like Jared Cook.
I like Fred Davis.
Sleeper picks, Fred Davis with RG3. They're going to be sleeper picks you're going to want to look out for.
When you're thinking about the tight end position, you're really looking for more. When you get on the lower tier, just looking for opportunity. If you're a guy, if you can find a guy who's going to be the clear-cut starter, that's good enough. You're going to pick him up for $1, and you're going to get solid production that other people would be paying, $7, $8, $9 for. So if you're thinking about the value you're getting and then you can use that value somewhere else, I think that's the way to go.
I agree with that. All right, moving on. Speaking of, let's who's your biggest fantasy sleeper and who's the biggest fantasy bust? Let's give one each.
Okay. Well, I can start that. This is actually ties into the tight end conversation a little bit. Actually, my biggest fantasy sleeper for this year is Jacob Tamme. I think that people are kind of like undervaluing Tamme. He's like only worth like $1 or $2, but there's a lot of familiarity there with Peyton Manning, and if there's one thing that Peyton Manning's done over his career, and that includes when he was a rookie, and it also includes in his heyday when he had the big guys like Marvin Harrison and Reggie Wayne on the outside, he always takes care of his tight end. Dallas Clark had amazing seasons with Peyton Manning and didn't look all that great without him. Jacob Tamme, when Dallas Clark was hurt, had a pretty damn good season himself, and now he's back with him in Denver. And I think with a receiving core that isn't Marvin Harrison, it isn't Reggie Wayne, you're going to see him leaning on Tamme a lot, and that's going to lead to a big fantasy season for Tamme. I'm not talking top 3 tight end, not talking top 5 tight end. I'm talking maybe top 7, but it's also going to be for $1. So if you're looking for a sleeper tight end that might be like a fantasy starter for literally no money in an auction draft, or like a real late round pick, like end of the draft pick, I think Jacob Tamme could be your guy. But there is a little buyer beware. Obviously, Peyton Manning goes down, Tammy's value completely plummets.
True.
So it really has to come down to with what you think Manning's going to be. I mean, we've already talked about this early in the podcast. You guys know how I stand on Peyton Manning. I think he's going to come back to, if not form, to be a solid starter. And I think that as a result of that, Jacob Tamme is going to be a solid starter as well. But if you think Peyton Manning's going to be kind of flimsy, then I'd steer clear of him. So it all comes down to Peyton Manning's welfare. Now, in terms of the biggest bust, I'm actually going to pick what is a lot of people's fan favorite, but I suppose also a lot of people's big. People kind of expect him to be a bust a little bit. But this is the first year I've bought into it, and that's Michael Turner. Now, the last couple of years, I think the last 2 years or something like that, there's always been somebody like crying out, "Hey, Michael Turner, he's had 350 touches last year, 330 touches last year. He's going to be a bust this year." I'm saying that this year, from what I saw at the end of at the end of the season last year, I think that that cliff is about that brick wall is about to come up upon him, and I think that this year is when you're going to see it. Huge drop in production. You're going to see either an injury or he's just going to be plain bad. And I think that at the prices people are drafting Michael Turner at, he's still going as like a fantasy number 1 or a fantasy number 2. I would not take him there. I think that he's going to, he's going to have issues. This is the year that it all catches up to him, and that Michael Turner is going to be a big bust compared to where he's being drafted.
In this case, you might want to look at a Jaquiz Rogers, who, if Turner starts to struggle, he finally hits that wall, it might be his time to shine.
Yeah, Rogers looks pretty good too. He wouldn't even be a bad step in. I think he actually has a lot of talent, and he might be able to get some good numbers if Turner, in fact, does hit that wall or goes down with an injury.
So buyer beware of Michael Turner, and if you do take him, I would recommend handcuffing him with Jaquiz Rogers.
Okay, so, in terms of sleeper, also my thought was some guy, probably not like a superstar guy, but this is a guy you're going to get for like $1, maybe a couple of bucks. This is a guy, Carson Palmer. Carson Palmer last year, people really weren't paying attention, but he actually, in spite of the crazy situation he was dealing with from just not playing football to just all of a sudden coming to the Raiders and just having no training camp, nothing to work with, actually didn't put up the worst numbers ever. Didn't really work with, healthy receivers a lot of the time. He still put up, okay production. And I'm not saying he's, again, a top 5 quarterback, but this is a guy who's going to have a training camp. In theory, he's going to have a couple of healthy guys in DHB, Denarius Moore, who aren't terrible receivers to work with. Have an okay running game. A decent, hopefully a little bit more stability for himself. And that could be a guy who, for a couple of bucks, could provide, a low tier, possibly even a top 10 quarterback production for very cheap money. So I kind of like a guy like that, In terms of fantasy busts, there are a few ways you can go with this. You can look at a guy like Adrian Peterson because for some reason he's being drafted as if you're going to be making him RB1. I think that's insane. But the way I'm going to go is Cam Newton. And look, we all know what Cam Newton did last year, and he's one of my favorite players to watch too. He's got all kinds of athletic talent, certainly a Michael Vick prototype, except a little bit more physical, explosive. My issue with him is that towards the latter part of the year, he started having issues at passer because his favorite target, Steve Smith, would just be constantly double teamed, and there wasn't much of an answer for him. So I don't really know if he's going to have like a real great answer. And by the way, he doesn't have a lot of great receiving options to work with. And when you are a quarterback, you are passing football primarily. We know his running prowess, and which also leads me to believe that there's a little bit of injury factor there for any running quarterback. But I don't see a lot of talent at the wide receiver position, and I don't know if he's going to be able to put together the answers to help, sort of get Steve Smith like off some of those double teams that were kind of hampering him. Because once those are happening, his production went down a lot, and you're going to be paying for a guy who you want to be a top 3 to top 5 quarterback, and you might not be getting that this year. So in terms of the bust factor, I'm looking at Cam Newton, unfortunately, and it hurts me to say.
Yeah, and I completely agree with you on Cam Newton. I think that it's going to be a big issue for him and Steve Smith this year in fantasy. They're both overvalued. And but one word on Carson Palmer. I actually really like that you brought him up because he is someone that is kind of off everybody's radar. And I completely agree. He's probably, for a buck, he's completely worth it. And, he adds a lot of value to his other receivers, which people don't actually understand. I think you're going to see a decent year from Denarius Moore this year. Mm-hmm. Maybe even Darius Hayward-Bay, although I felt like Denarius Moore was kind of Carson Palmer's favorite.
Right.
But so they're all kind of under the radar players. Like the entire Raiders team, except for Darren McFadden, is kind of the under the radar. But the thing I'd want, I'd kind of think about with Carson Palmer is I wouldn't, take that suggestion to mean that, what I should do? I should draft Carson Palmer as my fantasy starter. There is a lot of questions with Carson Palmer.
Of course.
He's amazing for $1. Definitely worth it as a backup QB. But I'd still take somebody else, even if it's just like, Phil Rivers or Joe Flacco. If you're gonna hope for like, kind of a QB roulette trying to figure out who the best QB is, Carson Palmer's a great addition. You can definitely get him for $1. But I would not, even if he puts up good numbers this year, there's so many questions that I wouldn't put him as, like, he definitely would be overvalued if you were to buy him for more than just that $1 or $2.
Right, and what I mean, and like what Prince is saying, I'm not telling you he's going to be like the top fantasy quarterback this year. I'm just saying for his value, he can provide you a lot more than most $1 players do. So that's just someone to think about. And I think he's definitely got it right. No one's talking about the Raiders for any of their pieces. So and they have some okay pieces to work with if you're willing to dig a little bit.
And that same thing goes for Jacob Tamme. What I was talking about before. Mm-hmm. Just because I think he's going to be a top 7 tight end this year, it doesn't mean that I think you should draft him for $10. He's worth $1 right now. I wouldn't spend more than $1 or $2 on him, and he should probably, ideally, if he's not your number 2 tight end, you should have a couple of number 2 tight ends to kind of work with to try to hit one that works.
True. Diversify your portfolio. All right, last but definitely not least question, and this is a very interesting one. This probably won't be relevant at all, but we have to have it. Gluten-free Josh Freeman or vegan Arian Foster? Whose diet is more fantasy relevant?
Just for a little background, everybody, both Josh Freeman and Arian Foster very publicly announced changes to their diet for one reason or another. Arian Foster went vegan, and Josh Freeman went gluten-free. So, Adam, I'll let you start with this. This is definitely more of your interest than mine.
Well, it's interesting. Kind of odd diet choices. For me, here's my breakdown. Just a quick summary of the gluten-free diet. It's not going to really restrict you much, except for the grain category. Gluten is a protein, I believe, that is found in most standard grains, like your breads, your pastas. There are gluten-free breads, there are gluten-free beers, there are gluten-free pretty much anything. From my point of view, protein intake isn't an issue. You still get all the meats, all the good stuff. Okay, it just cuts out wheat. And for me, I think this will help out Josh Freeman, maybe provide a little bit more stability in his life, Maybe he just cuts out those, glutens. Maybe he doesn't have so much of that stuff going on. Maybe his tummy feels a little bit better. Maybe he puts up better fantasy performance. Veganism, brief summary, no animal products allowed. No eggs, no fish, no meat, none of that. A little bit more restrictive, especially when you're thinking about the protein intake. But, Arian Foster's a professional. I'm sure he has people out there helping him out, making sure he gets the right nutrients. I don't think it affects him either way. I think Josh Freeman's gluten-free diet will actually give you a little bit of fantasy impact.
And strangely enough, I actually agree with Adam, but not for the same reasons. I'm digging back very, very, very far into my knowledge of nutrition and bodybuilding nutrition. I'm going to make quick analysis of these diets and what may come from. Well, first off, let me just rephrase. I think that Josh Freeman will be most positively affected by his diet, or least negatively affected. I do not think Josh Freeman is a better pick than Arian Foster.
Exactly.
So let's just make sure that we realize that Arian Foster is still the better draft pick. But all right, so in terms of gluten-free, first off, gluten-free isn't really gluten-free. It just means that you can only do a moderate amount, what is considered a safe amount of gluten, which is a very, very small amount of that wheat protein that Adam's talking about. But what that means is there's still other types of carbohydrates you can have. You can still have a very balanced diet of carbohydrates, proteins, and or when I say carbohydrates, I don't mean like vegetables and stuff like that. I'm talking about the bread type of the non-gluten bread, stuff like that. And the meats are definitely still involved, which you don't have with veganism. And what you get there is a more balanced protein intake for an athlete. And protein breakdown is hugely important for athletes trying to build muscle, trying to build quickness. And the proteins in meats are casein proteins, and the proteins in milk like whey, which you wouldn't get with a vegan diet. Those are actually the most efficient in terms of breaking down for your muscles to use. And the loss of gluten wouldn't affect that, so the gluten-free diet wouldn't hurt Freeman too much. It may actually make him feel better because of the issues that he may have with gluten. Now, in terms of Arian Foster, the veganism, it really probably won't affect him that much. A lot of people say that they feel a lot more energetic, with the clean vegan diet. But the issue that I have is that the only protein that Arian Foster can really have is soy protein, and soy protein is among the least efficient proteins for the body to break down and use, which might affect his training and his improvement. And maybe his training camp doesn't go as well this year because of the way he's not getting the protein the same way he used to. Those whey proteins and those casein proteins, people take them for granted, but it's very important to have that healthy mix. And even with soy protein can kind of replace the protein in general in your diet, but it's not as efficient for bodybuilding. It's not as efficient for working out, and it's not as efficient for football training camp. So I'm going to go with, because of the diets and the fact that Josh Freeman is least affected by his diet, I feel like Josh Freeman is going to be least negatively affected rather than necessarily better. But Arian Foster's still a better player.
True.
And I should just point out, I don't mean to say that Josh Freeman's immediately a number one pick.
That's what he means.
I'm just saying.
I saw his draft order.
Yeah.
It was Josh Freeman because gluten. Arian Foster was like last or something.
Just a quick side note: with the gluten-free diet, you're still out vodka, so go vodka.
Noted.
And on that note, thank you for tuning in. We'll be sure to do this again sometime, obviously during the season. I don't know if this will be a weekly thing, but definitely every couple of weeks.
See what happens with it.
We do a fantasy wrap up, but
this is Prez.
This is exciting.
This is Viggs.
This is Chris. Thank you for tuning in, and
we'll see you
stay
next time.
classy.
Later.
Good luck in your drafts, guys.